Most people think being poor is a paycheck problem. I do not think that is true. I think being poor is usually a system problem. A paycheck can be too small, of course. A wage can be unfair. A labor market can absolutely underprice effort. I am not naive about that. But if you really want to understand why so many hard-working people stay trapped year after year, you have to stop looking only at income and start looking at mechanics. That is how I have always tried to understand the world. Not by asking what story sounds comforting, by asking what machine is actually running underneath the story. And when I look at the modern economic machine, I do not see a clean moral contest where the diligent are steadily rewarded and the careless are steadily punished. I see something colder than that. I see a system that is perfectly capable of taking a hardworking person, a responsible person, even a very disciplined person, and still keeping him stuck because he never learned the physics of wealth. That is the phrase I want you to remember. The physics of wealth, most people never study it. They study motivation. They study hustle. They study productivity tricks. They study morning routines. They study what millionaires supposedly eat for breakfast. Very little of that matters if the economic structure of your life is still arranged in a way that keeps you poor, no matter how sincere your effort is. I want to say something plainly before we go further. If you are exhausted, if you are working full-time or more, if you are trying to be responsible, if you are skipping things you want, if you are staring at the end of each month wondering how you can possibly be trying this hard and still be so close to zero, I do not want you carrying unnecessary shame. There is enough pain in that condition already. You do not need false moral blame piled on top of it. You are not automatically broke because you are lazy. You are not automatically broke because you are stupid. And you are certainly not broke because you bought one coffee too many. That sort of advice insults the scale of the real problem. The real problem is structural. A person can buy cheaper groceries, skip vacations, work overtime, and still remain trapped if he never changes the engine that converts his effort into financial reality. That is what I want to explain. When I was younger, I became interested in money, not because I loved luxury, but because I loved freedom. Money fascinated me because it seemed to offer something labor alone never fully offered: margin. Optionality, the ability to say no, the ability to wait. The ability to survive a bad season without surrendering your life to whatever terms someone else placed in front of you. That is what money is for at its highest level. Not display, not applause, not proving to strangers that you matter. Money at its best is controlled breathing. And poverty, real poverty, is not just having a small bank account. It is the absence of breathing room. It is a situation in which one illness, one broken transmission, one rent increase, one lost shift, one dentist bill, one bureaucratic delay, one family emergency can shove your whole life sideways. That is what people mean when they say they feel trapped. They do not always mean that their income is literally zero. They mean they have no margin for reality, and reality always collects. I want to break this down the way I would break down a business. I do not begin with slogans. I begin with constraints. What is the input? What is the output? What are the hidden leakages? What are the structural disadvantages? What is the ownership model? What is compounding for me and what is compounding against me? That is how you must look at your own life if you want to stop being used by systems that understand money better than you do. There are 3 traps that keep most working people pinned in place. Then there is one escape protocol. That is the frame. If you understand the 3 traps, you stop blaming yourself in useless ways. If you execute the escape protocol, you begin building the first real separation between yourself and the treadmill. The first trap is what I call the biological time equation. This is the oldest trap in modern labor. It is so familiar that most people do not even realize it is a trap. They think it is simply life. You work an hour, you get paid for an hour. If you want more money, you work more hours. If you want much more money, you get better at selling your hours. That sounds reasonable because it is simple, visible, and culturally approved. It is also the foundation of the cage. Here is why. You only have so many hours. That is not philosophy. That is physics. You get 24 in a day. You can fantasize about optimization all you want. But there is a fixed ceiling overhead. You sleep or you collapse. You commute or you stay home. You cook, clean, recover, maintain your body, answer messages, deal with family needs, take care of life. By the time all of that is accounted for, the amount of time you can sell is finite. So the first brutal truth is this. If your income depends primarily on selling your own hours, then your income is capped by biology long before it is capped by ambition. A person earning $15 an hour feels it painfully. A person earning $40 an hour feels more comfortable. A person earning $80 an hour can feel almost wealthy for a while, but all three are still inside the same underlying system. The money stops when the hours stop. That matters much more than people admit, because when your life is built on hours alone, everything good requires continuous functioning. You must stay healthy, you must stay employable, you must stay available, you must stay acceptable to whoever is buying your time. You must avoid interruption. And that is a very fragile position, even when the paycheck looks decent. I have known people with six-figure incomes who were still living in a state of quiet servitude because every dollar depended on their ongoing presence, their continued performance, and the market's continued willingness to keep paying them at the same rate. That is not ownership. That is expensive dependence. There is another ugly fact inside this first trap. The market does not pay you according to how hard the day felt. It pays you according to how difficult you are to replace and how much value your output creates relative to its alternatives. This is why effort alone is such a dangerous god. The public worships effort because effort looks noble. The market respects leverage because leverage multiplies output. Those are not the same thing. If you are lifting boxes all day, standing all day, driving all day, typing all day, scanning all day, answering all day, the physical and emotional fatigue may be enormous. I do not dismiss that. But if someone can be trained to do your job in a few weeks or months, your bargaining power remains weak no matter how honest your exhaustion is. That sounds harsh. It is still true. A market system does not hug you because you tried hard. It asks one cold question: how much value do you control relative to how replaceable you are? Once you understand that, you stop expecting rescue from effort alone. That is important. Because many people were raised to believe the world functions like a moral report card. Do the right thing, work hard, follow the rules, and eventually the reward will arrive. Sometimes it does. Often it does not arrive in the form they expected because they confused obedience with leverage. Those are not the same thing. When I think about leverage, I do not mean recklessness. I mean systems that let 1 unit of your effort create more than 1 unit of output. A software creator writes code once and distributes it thousands or millions of times. A writer writes once and thousands read. An owner buys one good business and its earnings continue while he sleeps. A landlord with a sound property structure collects rent from an asset. A capital owner receives dividends from an enterprise that keeps selling products without requiring him to clock in every morning. That is leverage, and leverage is the true exit from the biological time equation. It is not motivational fluff. It is arithmetic. If I can only sell 1 hour once, I remain trapped inside the clock. If I can create or own something that keeps producing without demanding my constant physical presence, then for the first time I am beginning to separate income from my body. That separation is where wealth begins, not because money suddenly rains from the sky, because your life is no longer fully hostage to the next week's labor. This is why I say the first trap is deeper than low wages. It is the architecture of labor dependence itself, and that architecture is why so many hardworking people remain tired, dutiful, responsible, and still financially exposed year after year. Now let us move to the second trap, because this one is more invisible and therefore more dangerous. The second trap is what I call the saver's punishment. This is one of the cruelest ideas modern finance ever dressed up as prudence. From childhood, people are told to save money. Good savings matter. I like prudence. I like reserves. I like margin. But what most people are not taught is the difference between saving as temporary protection and hoarding cash as a long-term strategy. Those are not the same thing. A reserve is wise. A life built on idle cash is often quietly self-destructive. The reason is simple. Modern fiat money is not a stable store of value over long periods. It is a medium that governments and central banks can dilute whenever political and financial conditions make that path attractive, and that path is attractive often. When a government runs large deficits, when a central bank wants to stimulate, when the system wants to reduce the real burden of debt without openly saying so. Inflation becomes the polite form of theft. That sentence will offend the people who like respectable language. I do not care. It is economically accurate. If you work for years to stack $50,000 in a low-yield account, and the purchasing power of those dollars is steadily reduced by inflation, while the account pays you next to nothing, then your life energy is being quietly siphoned away. The screen may still show 50,000. Reality does not care what the screen says. Reality asks what 50,000 will buy, and that number changes. This is why I have always wanted people to understand that cash is not a final destination. It is a temporary parking place, a useful one, an important one, a necessary one for reserves and near-term obligations, but not a worship object, not a strength. A lot of people feel rich when they see a cash number. That is often an illusion, especially if the number is large enough to feel emotionally comforting and small enough to be economically lazy. The source text captures this well in spirit, and I agree with the core message. If your whole strategy is simply stacking paper claims while the system keeps diluting them, then you are not protecting wealth. You are watching it melt politely. The wealthy understand this instinctively, even when they cannot explain it elegantly. They do not generally leave their money sitting in dead cash any longer than necessary. They move it into businesses, into equities, into real estate, into land, into operating assets, into productive claims, into structures that can reprice, earn, distribute, or appreciate with the productive economy. That is not because rich people are reckless. It is because they understand that ownership protects purchasing power more reliably than idle currency over long stretches. Again, I want to be precise. I am not saying keep no cash. That would be idiotic. A household with no reserve is fragile. Fragility is expensive. What I am saying is different. The reserve is not the plan. The reserve protects the plan. Once you have enough liquidity to keep life from turning every inconvenience into a crisis, the next dollar should not pile up forever in melting form if your goal is wealth. They should begin purchasing ownership. That is the shift from saver to owner. And most people never make that shift because they were taught that saving itself was the destination rather than the bridge. That misunderstanding ruins them quietly. Think of a squirrel in autumn. A squirrel stores food because winter is real. That is wisdom. But if the squirrel could own an orchard and instead kept praising itself for storing a handful of nuts while someone else kept taking the trees, we would not call that prudence. We would call it tragic. That is what many households do with cash. They build a little pile and call it security while inflation, taxation, and asset appreciation move the ownership economy further away from them every year. The reserve matters. The orchard matters more. That is the distinction. Now, the third trap is even uglier because it recruits your own ego as the enforcer. I call it funding the illusion. This is where the culture and the debt system begin working together. A person works hard. The first trap keeps his income tied to hours. The second trap erodes the value of any idle savings. Then the culture steps in and whispers a poisonous offer. If you cannot be wealthy yet, you can still look wealthy right now. That sentence has bankrupted more futures than most people realize. Consumer culture is not merely selling products. It is selling emotional anesthesia. It sells relief from status anxiety, relief from comparison, relief from the humiliation of feeling invisible. The car is not just transportation. It is a story. The phone is not just a tool. It is a badge. The clothes are not just fabric. They are positioning. The vacation is not just rest. It is evidence. And because many people do not yet have the real wealth to buy those things outright without consequence, the system hands them another seductive instrument, consumer debt. This is where the trap becomes almost perfect. The first trap keeps you dependent on labor. The second trap weakens idle savings. The third trap tells you that you can still perform success in the meantime by borrowing against your future. It is a viciously intelligent machine. You finance the vehicle, you finance the watch, you finance the furniture, you finance the lifestyle, then you tell yourself that you deserve it because you work so hard, and life is stressful, and one must enjoy something. I understand every word of that emotional logic. I still reject the math. A finance status object is often one of the worst trades a working person can make. You are using future labor to pay interest on something whose primary job is to shape other people's impression of you. That is madness. The car dealership loves it, the bank loves it, the brand loves it. The future version of you usually does not. And what makes the system so effective is that the ego tax feels like progress while it is happening. You sit in the new car, you hold the new device, you post them, you feel briefly aligned with the image of the life you thought success would look like. Then the payment arrives. Then the next one, then the repair, the insurance, the maintenance, the card balance, the interest, the quiet dread, the feeling that you cannot stop because now you must support the illusion you already purchased. That is how people become well-dressed prisoners. They are not poor in appearance, they are poor in margin. And margin is what matters. When I see a man in a very expensive vehicle, I do not automatically think wealth. Sometimes I think obligation. Sometimes I think the bank chose the car. Sometimes I think he is working partly for the parking lot. Real wealth is not usually what strangers see. Real wealth is what you do not have to explain. It is the reserve that lets you sleep. It is the brokerage account compounding quietly. It is the low fixed cost structure. It is the lack of panic. It is the ability to ignore a bad boss, survive a bad quarter, help family from strength, and say no without checking the account twice first. That is wealth. The ego tax consumes the very capital that could have built it. The culture does this on purpose, even if no single person is consciously directing the whole system. Advertising teaches aspiration without arithmetic. Social media teaches comparison without context. Credit systems teach access without consequence. Then the working person internalizes a poisonous formula. If I cannot yet own freedom, I can at least rent the costume of it. That costume becomes a bill. The bill becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes a life. You do not have to hate luxury to see this clearly. I like quality. I like good workmanship. I like beauty. But beauty bought from weakness does not stay beautiful for long. A luxury item bought from real surplus can be a harmless pleasure. The same item bought from borrowed money, no reserves, weak income flexibility, and an already stressed life is a tax on the future. That is the distinction. And most people ignore it because they are not buying the thing for the thing. They are buying the emotional sentence attached to the thing. That is why the trap is psychological before it is financial. You cannot break it just by telling someone the interest rate. You break it when they finally understand that impressing strangers is one of the worst business models ever invented. So, here we are. 3 traps. The biological time equation keeps your income tied to your body. The saver's punishment silently erodes any cash you leave. Idle too long. The ego tax persuades you to borrow against the future to buy signs of success instead of the structure of success. If you understand these 3 things clearly, a lot of your old confusion begins disappearing. You stop asking why hard work alone is not fixing everything. You stop asking why the bank balance feels strangely weak despite years of effort. You stop asking why people with apparently decent salaries still seem afraid all the time. The machine is working exactly as designed. That is the bad news. Now for the good news, once you can see the machine, you do not have to keep serving it in the same way. I am not going to insult you with fantasies. There is no magic switch. There is no little trick that turns a broke worker into a wealthy owner by next Thursday. The exit is real. It is also hard. And it is hard because it requires a kind of cold discipline the culture does not reward in the short run. I call it the escape protocol, 3 steps. No drama, no motivational screaming, just order. The first step is stop the bleeding. That means destroy high-interest consumer debt. Not slowly, not casually, not with a few symbolic extra dollars, aggressively. Anything in the high teens or 20s is financial poison: credit card balances, predatory personal loans, buy now pay, ladder strings that mimic card debt. Anything of that nature must be treated as a fire. And when I say fire, I mean the sort of thing that outranks entertainment. Ego purchases, restaurant spending, unnecessary subscriptions, and status spending immediately. I do not care how much the outfit means to you, how long you wanted the vacation, or how badly you feel you deserve the reward. If the interest meter is running at 24%, the reward is not a reward. It is a delayed punishment. A person in this stage must be willing to look poor for a while in order to stop being poorer later. That is a very hard ask in a society built around appearance. Do it anyway. Sell what should not have been financed. Downgrade what needs downgrading. Drive the dull car. Use the old phone. Cut the expensive rituals that only exist to impress or numb. Attack the balances. Create a plan list every debt by rate. Hit the highest rate first. Automate minimums on the rest. Roll every freed up payment forward. You are not reorganizing your life here. You are extinguishing a chemical fire. The second step is build leverage. Not emotional leverage, not borrowed leverage, productive leverage. This is where most people get discouraged because they hear the word leverage and imagine something glamorous or out of reach. No, leverage begins very simply. It begins when you stop asking, how can I work harder, and start asking, how can 1 hour of my effort become more than 1 hour of output? That may mean learning a skill with pricing power, writing code selling at high ticket values, building a digital product, creating content with long shelf life, learning performance marketing, owning a small business system, buying productive assets, improving into a field where your replacement cost rises sharply. Leverage is anything that breaks the direct one-to-one relationship between your body and your income. That is the definition that matters. If you leave your job at 5 and every meaningful dollar in your future still depends entirely on tomorrow's shift, then you are still inside the first trap. The escape begins when you use time outside your wage job to build something that can keep working when you are not physically there. This is why I do not tell most people to quit their jobs dramatically. That is television advice. It is usually stupid. Your job funds the transition. Respect that. But do not let your life end where the shift ends. The hours after work are either your escape hours or your drift hours. That is the honest distinction. If they are consumed entirely by consumption, distraction, exhaustion rituals, and unplanned living, the years will pass and nothing structural will change. If even some portion of them becomes dedicated to building leverage, then the future begins behaving differently. Not quickly, differently. That is enough. The person who spends 2 focused hours a night for 3 years learning, building, selling, and creating has not merely worked harder. He has changed the architecture of people. Underestimate architecture because it is invisible while it is being installed. Then one day they are surprised when someone else's life has different ceilings. No, the ceilings changed because the structure changed. The third step is asset conversion. Once the bleeding slows and leverage starts producing surplus, the game changes again. Now the question becomes what to do with the surplus. This is where many people fail a second time. They escape the debt trap only to fall into the lifestyle trap. Their income improves a little. They feel relief. Then immediately they inflate the life to match the relief. That is how the treadmill speeds up again. Do not do that. When surplus appears, convert it into productive assets, broad equity index funds, productive businesses, tax, advantaged accounts, reasonable real estate, where the economics are sound, hard assets where appropriate. The exact instruments can vary, the principle does not. Convert temporary currency into enduring claims on productive value. That is how you stop being merely a worker with better cash flow and start becoming an owner. Ownership is the turning point. That is when your money begins sending reinforcements. At first it is tiny, then it grows. Then one day you realize a small piece of your monthly stress is now being handled by capital rather than by labor. That is a remarkable moment. It does not feel like a movie. It feels like breathing room. Then the breathing room compounds. People think financial freedom arrives with fireworks. Usually it arrives with less panic, less dependence, less ego spending, more quiet, more control, more ability to say no. The culture will not cheer for this version of progress. It cannot photograph it well enough. Who cares? You are not building for the audience. You are building for exit, and exit is invisible at first. I want to say one more thing because it matters. You do not have to hate rich people to understand any of this. Hatred is lazy. What you need is clarity. There are good rich people and foolish rich people, disciplined poor people and self-sabotaging poor people, honest owners and dishonest ones, exploitative systems and real opportunities. Reality is mixed. I do not need ideology here. I need arithmetic. The arithmetic says this: if your life remains fully dependent on selling hours, if your reserves remain idle too long in melting form, and if your income gets sacrificed to status through debt, then you can work harder than everyone you know and still remain trapped. That is not a motivational failure. It is a design failure. Redesign the system. That is the whole answer. Stop the bleeding. Build leverage. Convert surplus into ownership. Repeat. Not for 6 weeks, for years. That is how the physics changes. That is how an employee slowly becomes a capital allocator. That is how a person stops funding everyone else's machine and starts building one of his own. There is a final comfort in all this, and I do mean comfort. Once you understand the mechanics, the shame starts lifting. You no longer need to call yourself lazy every time the numbers stay tight. You no longer need to believe that one coffee or one mistake or 1 weak month explains the whole trap. You no longer need to compare your invisible struggle with somebody else's borrowed display. You can look at your life much more coldly and therefore much more usefully. What is the rate? What is the leverage? What is the reserve? What is the ownership? What is the ego tax? What is the next structural move? Those are adult questions. Those are the questions that lead somewhere. Not why am I not rich yet? Not what am I doing wrong as a person? What is the machine doing and how do I stop standing in its teeth? That is the right frame. And once you get that right, the whole financial story changes, not overnight, but for real. That is enough.